April 1945, the war's final breath, northern Germany, near a half-burned village. The air smelled of wet ash and diesel. Along the dirt road, 20 German women stood with trembling hands raised, their grey auxiliary uniforms streaked with mud. Behind them, a convoy of British armoured trucks rolled to a halt. Engines hummed, boots crunched the gravel. Then silence, the kind that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. One of the women whispered, "They'll shoot us, they have to." The others believed it too. They had been told for months that capture meant death, that Allied soldiers never spared female Flakwerf or Wehrmacht auxiliaries. "You served Hitler," their officers had said, "you'll die for him." And now, staring down black barrels of Lee-Enfield rifles, it felt like prophecy. But the British soldiers didn't fire. They just stared back, tired faces under steel helmets, dust on their cheeks. A single order cracked the stillness: keep them there. That voice, flat and firm, belonged to a British major stepping from the lead truck. He looked no older than 30, but his eyes had seen too much. He scanned the line of captives and girls, not monsters, some no older than his sister. Reports estimate that in those final weeks, more than 500,000 German women served in auxiliary roles: clerks, radio operators, nurses, and anti-aircraft spotters. Many had been dragged into uniform in the Reich's desperate last year. Some fired guns, most never did. But the fear was the same: captured equals executed. The major's second order came quieter and stranger. "Lower weapons," he said. The rifles dipped. "Search them then." He hesitated, as if embarrassed to speak the next word aloud. "Feed them." The women didn't move at first. They didn't understand. Feed them, not shoot. A soldier opened a ration tin. The metallic click echoed louder than any gunshot. The smell of corned beef filled the air. Hunger hit harder than fear. One woman sobbed without sound, her legs giving way. In that moment, the story the Reich had drilled into them, the myth of merciless enemies, began to crack. But none of them could yet guess how far that crack would go, or how deep their shock would run when the Guard's next order arrived. The rifles lowered, and the British major's voice cut through the drizzle again, flat, official, almost embarrassed by its own mercy. "Get them food." For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. The British soldiers looked at each other like they'd misheard. The women stared in disbelief. A moment earlier, they'd been waiting for a volley of bullets. Now a corporal was opening a tin of corned beef with a bayonet. Steam from field kettles drifted through the campyard, smelling of tea and grease. The women stood in stunned lines while British soldiers ladled stew into battered cups. Not a word was spoken. The only sound was metal scraping against tin, rain tapping canvas, and the quiet shock of survival. Corporal Jameson, a lanky kid from Leeds, muttered to his mate, "Never thought I'd serve dinner to the enemy." His friend just shrugged. Orders are orders. Behind them, the major watched, arms folded, face unreadable. He knew morale was brittle. Mercy could look like weakness. But these prisoners weren't threats. They were starving, filthy, hollow-eyed. British rations in 1945 averaged around 0 calories per day porridge, corned beef, bread, tea, and jam. By contrast, German soldiers at the front sometimes survived on under 500 calories, and civilians in the Reich were near collapse. When one of the women tasted the stew, her eyes filled instantly. She wasn't crying from gratitude. It was confusion, disbelief. Later, in a post-war diary found decades after, one wrote, "They fed us better than our own officers ever did. We were enemies, yet for the first time I was not afraid." As they ate, rain softened the edges of everything: the mud, the tension, the uniforms that now looked absurdly similar in color. A British medic passed by, dropping a wool blanket on each woman's shoulders. One whispered dank. He nodded without meeting her eyes. Across the campyard, a stray dog wandered between the lines. A soldier tossed it a biscuit. It wagged its tail, splattering mud over boots, and for one fleeting second everyone laughed. Human again, but that fragile moment of calm couldn't last. At dawn, new trucks would arrive, bringing fresh guards and new orders. Orders that would remind everyone that kindness in war always has limits. By morning, the rain had hardened the ground into a crust of grey mud. The captured women woke to the metallic clatter of breakfast tins being set out again. Hot tea, white bread, and sugar. Sugar, most hadn't seen it in months. A few stared at the cubes like they were jewels. One woman touched hers gently before dropping it into the steaming mug. It dissolved instantly, vanishing like the Reich they'd believed eternal. The British soldiers moved through the camp in quiet rhythm. Some joked, some sang under their breath, all weary but calm. They didn't bark orders, they didn't slap. They treated the women like people. And that, for the prisoners, was the strangest cruelty of all. A kindness so foreign it hurt. Across Europe, the numbers were staggering. 7 million Axis POW captured by the Western Allies in just the final 3 months of the war. Thousands of them were women, radio operators, nurses, typists. They had worn uniforms, taken oaths, yet now they sat on wooden crates, clutching tea mugs with shaking hands, their insignia stripped but their shame intact. One of them 20-year-old Helga Kruger kept glancing at the guards' faces. She whispered to the girl beside her, "They smile. Why do they smile?" The answer came from a guard polishing his rifle. He overheard and with a half-grin said, "Because it's over." She didn't understand. Over for whom? Later that day, as they were marched to the old farm being converted into a holding site, a small act broke the wall. A British private offered a piece of chocolate U.S. Army issue to the youngest prisoner. She hesitated, then took it. The guard shrugged and said, "Go on, it's not poisoned." She laughed nervously. It was the first sound of laughter that camp had heard. By evening, the women had blankets, tea, and a space in a drafty barn. The guards lit a fire in an oil drum. Someone played harmonica, a sound both alien and familiar. For the first time since capture, the women spoke softly to one another. Relief mixed with confusion. But peace didn't last long. At dawn, the sound of new engines rolled in. Fresh trucks, fresh boots, and with them, a new set of guards whose faces carried no hint of laughter. Engines rumbled before sunrise. The women stirred, clutching their blankets as unfamiliar voices barked commands outside. The easy rhythm of the previous day vanished the instant the new guards stepped in. Fresh uniforms, sharper boots, colder eyes. They moved like men still wired for combat, not caretaking. One slammed his rifle butt on the ground and shouted, "Everyone outside, line up now." The camp yard filled with fog and tension. A clipboard officer stood near a jeep, flanked by translators. His tone was clipped bureaucratic. "You will be separated by roll, nurses here, typists here, flak auxiliaries there." The words flak auxiliaries made the crowd flinch. Those were the women who'd manned anti-aircraft batteries, technically combatants, though many had only fetched shells or logged data. Still, it sounded like accusation. By Allied protocol, anyone who had directly assisted the German war machine could be interrogated. And that meant hundreds of young women suddenly branded as potential war criminals. Around 22% of the female auxiliaries had served as Flakhilferinnen, radar watchers and spotters for the Luftwaffe. Some had seen bombers fall, men burn. They remembered the cheers. Now they just stared at their boots. The officer's pencil tapped against his clipboard. Name, unit, assignment. The line shuffled forward. A nurse whispered prayers under her breath. One typist, trembling, muttered, "I was never a soldier." The translator didn't reply. His pen simply moved. From behind the rows of tents, the sound of hammers echoed. The women turned their heads. British engineers were raising new canvas shelters with white stenciled signs. Interrogation section. The realization spread like static. Whatever mercy they'd felt yesterday was about to be tested. One of the younger guards, barely 20, avoided eye contact as he handed out numbered tags. When a woman's hand brushed his by accident, he flinched not from disgust but confusion. She noticed. That fleeting human moment made the fear sharper. Later, when the lines broke, the whispers began. Why separate us? What happens in those tents? No one answered. But, as the lamps flickered to life that night, shadows moved behind the interrogation flaps. Pens scratched. Tea boiled, and not a scream could be heard, because what came next would be interrogation, without violence, without mercy, and without warning. The first to enter the tent was a 19-year-old Luftwaffe typist named Marta. She'd imagined fists, shouts, a dark room with a single bulb. Instead, she found a wooden table, a kettle steaming on a small stove, and a British sergeant with kind eyes and a stack of papers. He gestured for her to sit. Tea, he asked. The question landed like a grenade, polite, disarming, absurd. Outside, the camp buzzed with whispers. No one knew what happened inside those tents, only that no one returned bleeding. Fear turned into curiosity. From a distance, they could see silhouettes, guards leaning, translators writing, teacups lifted. It didn't look like punishment, it looked like conversation, and that was somehow more terrifying. Across Europe, Allied intelligence had learned that cooperation beat coercion. Reports show that nearly 80% of German records and troop positions were recovered through interviews, not beatings. The British called it the soft method: offer a cigarette, earn a story, show dignity, break denial. It worked. Marta's voice trembled at first. She insisted she only typed. No shooting, no killing. The sergeant nodded, scribbling notes. How many girls at your battery? He asked. 23. How many trained on the guns? 4, but we all logged the raids, and when the bombers fell, Marta hesitated. We cheered. The sergeant didn't react, he just wrote. The silence hurt worse than accusation. After half an hour he slid her a biscuit. You've done well, go rest. She blinked, unsure if it was a trick. Outside, she passed the next girl entering. They don't shout, Marta whispered, they just listen. That night the camp was quiet, no cries, no punishment. Only pens scratching and distant radio static. Some women felt their fear dissolve, replaced by something colder: exposure. Every word, every diary entry, every trivial secret now felt dangerous. One diary recovered years later carried a single line: they broke us with silence. As darkness settled, the last interrogator stepped out of his tent, rubbing his temples. Behind him, lanterns glowed like soft stars in the fog. From the mess tent came the faint hiss of a radio warming up. A strange tune flickered through the static. The rhythm was foreign, forbidden, alive. It started as a faint hiss through the camp's dusk static, then melody. The radio crackled to life in the mess tent, a warm hum spilling into the cold evening air. The guards had tuned in to the BBC Forces program. A trumpet slid into rhythm, then the unmistakable swing of Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Every German head in the camp turned. The song was electric, upbeat, carefree, almost sinful. Under the Third Reich, this kind of music had been banned for a decade. The regime had called it degenerate, enemy jazz that corrupted German youth. Many of these women had grown up being told listening to it was treason. Now the victors were playing it loud enough to echo through the barracks. Inside the tent, British soldiers were laughing, tapping boots on wooden floors, their cutlery clinking against metal trays. One sergeant even grabbed another's arm and spun him in mock dance. Outside, the prisoners froze. The sound felt like a portal into another world, one that hadn't known ration cards or propaganda broadcasts. One of the younger women whispered, "We used to listen to this secretly." Another added, "They killed a boy in Hamburg for playing this on the street." Neither smiled. The song wasn't just music. It was a reminder of everything their country had destroyed: freedom, laughter, rhythm itself. As night deepened, more guards gathered, humming along. The brass swelled, drums quickened. A guard leaned against a post, cigarette glowing in the dark, and noticed a prisoner sitting apart, tears streaking her soot, smudged cheeks. He hesitated, then walked over slowly. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, just shook her head. "We weren't allowed to feel happy," she murmured, "not for years." He looked down, unsure what to say. Finally, he exhaled smoke into the cold. Then maybe start now. For a second, the moment hung in the air, absurd, fragile, real. The trumpet hit its last bright note, and silence washed back over the camp. The guards returned to their posts. The prisoners returned to their thoughts. But the echo of that swing tune lingered like a ghost of the pre-war world, proof that joy itself had survived the rubble. And for one young guard, that single tear he'd seen wouldn't let him sleep. Private Lewis had barely slept. The swing tune still echoed in his head. But louder than that was the image of the crying woman outside the mess tent. By dawn, the camp was silent except for the soft rattle of tin mugs. Mist rolled over the fence line like pale smoke. He saw her again, sitting alone on a crate, clutching a chipped enamel cup. Her uniform hung loose. Her hands trembled from cold more than fear. He hesitated. Guards weren't supposed to talk much with prisoners, and certainly not with them. The female auxiliaries. But something about her stillness pulled him. He walked over, crouched to her level, and held out a folded handkerchief. No words, just a small gesture, simple, human. She stared at it like it was a weapon. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Their hands brushed, a flash of warmth in the damp morning. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He nodded once, stood, and walked off before the other guards could notice. Behind him, she pressed the handkerchief to her face and wept soundlessly. Later, she wrote in a note smuggled to another prisoner, "He treated me like a person. I didn't know how to respond." The camp that week was running over capacity. Reports show more than 60% of POW sites in spring 1945 held triple their intended numbers. Space was scarce, food barely stretched. Yet the British still brought in medical units. Hygiene, they said, meant control. The next morning, white tents appeared near the fence, Red Cross symbols painted fresh on canvas. Lewis watched as medics unpacked supplies. Soap, towels, gauze. The prisoners lined up, uncertain again. For days they had lived in filth and fear. Now they were being told to bathe. Some thought it a trick. Others whispered, "They're checking who's sick." Lewis found himself stationed by the water barrels. He caught the same woman's eye, once as she stepped out, clean hair clinging to her cheeks, wearing a British, issued wool sweater instead of her uniform. She didn't speak, but she nodded faint, almost invisible. That night, the camp smelled different. Less of sweat and diesel, more of soap and wood smoke. The guards said it felt civilized again. But for the prisoners, it was something else entirely, a rebirth that felt like shame and salvation in the same breath. The Red Cross tents glowed white against the grey morning, their canvas rippling in the wind. Orders went out briskly. Medical inspection, all prisoners. The women formed uneven lines, clutching blankets, unsure whether to fear or hope. The smell of disinfectant hit first, sharp, sterile, cutting through the musty air that had clung to them since capture. Inside the first tent, medics worked methodically. They spoke softly, almost clinically, as they examined each prisoner. Soap bars were handed out like treasure, followed by rough towels and new undergarments stamped British Army medical stores. The women undressed behind hanging sheets, shivering from cold and humiliation. Some wept quietly, not from pain, but from the realization that their captors were giving them what their own army never had, care. A medic scribbled notes on a clipboard. Lice, malnutrition, minor trench sores. Another sprayed disinfectant down the seams of a coat. The hiss of the nozzle sounded eerily like a gas release. One woman flinched violently, covering her face. The medic froze, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Not that kind of spray. He said. She didn't answer, but she stopped shaking. Across the camp, the transformation was visible by afternoon. The fire barrels steamed with drying laundry. Lines of wool uniforms hung limp in the breeze. British soldiers joked about the cleanest Germans in Europe. But privately, many were shaken by what they saw. Young women who looked decades older, their bodies brittle from years of scarcity. Records show that in Allied-run camps, typhus infections dropped by over 80% once hygiene programs began. Sanitation wasn't just kindness, it was survival for both sides. Disease had no allegiance. As night fell, the camp smelled of carbolic soap and boiled cabbage. The prisoners sat wrapped in clean blankets, steam rising from tin mugs of broth. A few dared to hum tunes under their breath, nothing military, just fragments of lullabies remembered from childhood. One British sergeant, watching from the fence, muttered, "We're washing the war off them." His comrade replied, "Off ourselves too, maybe." The next morning, the wind carried a new scent through camp: roasted flour and tinned butter. The kitchens had doubled output. What came next wasn't just hygiene. It was abundance on a scale the prisoners couldn't yet comprehend. By midweek, the camp looked like an anthill of motion, trucks backing in, kitchens roaring, steam curling from giant pots. The prisoners smelled it before they saw it. Meat, bread, coffee. Not the burnt barley substitute they knew from home, real coffee. A British quartermaster barked orders while soldiers unloaded crates stamped "Product of Canada" and U.S. Army rations. The women watched in stunned silence. Loaves of white bread stacked higher than helmets, cans of butter, corned beef, jam, a mountain of abundance. Most of them hadn't seen a full meal in years. Berlin civilians were down to 800 calories a day, and hospitals rationed potatoes by the ounce. Now here the enemy was boiling stew in vats the size of bathtubs. A corporal laughed as he sliced open a crate of chocolate bars. "More food than a bloody town needs," he said, half proud, half exhausted. To the German women it wasn't funny. It was dizzying. They had been told the Allies were starving too, living off propaganda and greed. But this was proof that Germany had never stood a chance. The war had been lost long before the guns fell silent. It was lost in the factories, in the fields, in the endless convoys across the Atlantic. Reports from 1944-45 confirm that Britain imported over 4 million tons of food despite U-boat threats. The pipeline of empire never stopped. Seeing it firsthand, tins labelled from Canada, flour from India, jam from New Zealand, broke something deep inside the prisoners. One of them muttered, "They don't fight hunger, they feed it." Another whispered, "How could we ever win against this?" The guards weren't gloating. They were just used to it. To them, a full plate was normal. To the women, it was surreal, like watching gods eat. That night, one guard caught 2 prisoners quietly licking the bottom of their stew tins long after dinner. He didn't shout. He just handed them another ladleful and walked away. The laughter from the mess tent drifted into the barracks like warm smoke. For the first time in years, bellies were full, and guilt came with it. Because plenty felt wrong when home was burning. And by dawn, that guilt would deepen when letters arrived, and most came back unopened. A week after their capture, paper arrived. Rough, yellowed, thin as onion skin. The British officer read the order aloud. Each prisoner may write 1 letter, 25 lines only. The women froze, then broke into whispers. Letters after weeks of silence, a way to reach home, or what was left of it. That evening, the barracks glowed with candlelight and sound. The soft scratching of pencils, the muffled sobs of women remembering addresses that might no longer exist. Some had families in Dresden or Königsberg, names that now meant ash in evacuation columns. One wrote, "Mama, I'm alive. Please tell father." Another simply wrote, "I am sorry." The guards collected the letters in sacks, tied them with string, and handed them to the British postal unit. A few days later, the first replies came, or rather didn't. Returned envelopes, stamped address unknown, or destroyed in action. For some, even the ink of their hope came back unopened. By May 1945, over 5 million German civilians were displaced or missing. Whole neighborhoods erased, family records burned, postal routes gone. For many prisoners, the silence that followed was worse than hunger. Private Lewis, the same guard who had once knelt beside a crying woman, found her sitting by the fence again, staring at a letter folded neatly but never opened. He didn't ask what it said. She whispered first, "They're gone." Then, almost to herself, "Home is gone before I even return." Around the camp, the laughter of the kitchens faded. The women worked quietly now, folding blankets, sweeping, helping medics. No orders demanded it. They just needed something to fill the silence. A few started sharing the letters that did arrive, smudged pages from surviving friends, written from rubble, strewn towns. The war is over, but nothing is left. At night, guards could hear them humming lullabies again, this time not for comfort, but remembrance. One dawn, trucks arrived at the gate, not with food this time, but with barrels of white paint and stacks of brushes. The major gathered the prisoners. His voice was cold, deliberate. "You'll be painting today," he said. Every wall, every symbol. The women looked at one another, unsure what sin they were about to erase. Rain fell steady that morning, thin, cold, relentless. The campyard turned to a swamp of brown slush as the prisoners were handed brushes, buckets, and barrels of thick white paint. The officer's order was simple: erase every symbol. No speeches, no lectures, just labor. Walls once marked with fading swastikas and eagles were now streaked with dripping white. Each stroke blurred the old world a little more, some painted with quiet relief, others with tears mixing into the rain. To many of them, the emblem they were covering wasn't just a regime's mark. It was their youth, their identity, their sense of belonging. Watching it vanish felt like watching themselves dissolve. By noon, the entire camp smelled of wet paint and rot. The brushes slopped and squeaked. A British sergeant walked past, checking work, saying little. A few guards looked uneasy. This wasn't punishment, but it felt like one. The women didn't complain, they just kept painting, their fingers raw and pale from cold. All across occupied Germany, scenes like this were unfolding. Records show that over 6 million Germans were subjected to Allied denazification. Programs between 1945 and 1948. Interviews, screenings, mandatory cleanups. Some called it justice. Others called it humiliation. Most called it necessary. One prisoner, a former Flakhilferin, muttered under her breath, "Each stroke feels like erasing myself." Another whispered back, "Maybe that's the point." In the distance, hammering began again, this time from the assembly shed. The guards were setting up a projector and screen. Rumors rippled through the camp, a film tonight. No one knew what kind. Some hoped it was newsreel footage, something to prove their towns still existed. Others feared worse. By dusk, the walls gleamed white in the fading light, blank and silent. The campyard looked eerily clean, too clean, like an empty page waiting to be rewritten. The guards herded everyone inside, where benches had been laid out facing the flickering screen. When the generator coughed to life, the projector light cut through cigarette smoke. The first frame appeared, barbed wire, gaunt faces, striped uniforms, no introduction, no commentary. Just horror on celluloid. The women went still. No one breathed. No one spoke. And for the first time, they began to understand what they were truly erasing. The projector hummed, its light slicing through the smoke, filled air. The women sat shoulder to shoulder on crude benches, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale in the flicker. At first, they thought it was just another war reel, something about bombed cities or prisoners of war. Then the camera panned, barbed wire, skeletal figures, rows of corpses stacked like firewood, no narration. No music, just silence and the faint whir of film. The guards didn't look away, neither did the medics. The reel showed Ravensbrück. The women in the footage were their age, same braids, same uniforms, but hollow eyes. Starved, stripped, broken. Some of the prisoners watching had even heard rumors before. The camps are just work colonies. But rumor shattered the moment the reel cut to bulldozers pushing bodies into trenches. Allied cameramen documented everything in April 1945, liberation of concentration camps across Germany. The footage became evidence burned into the world's conscience. Over 130,000 women were imprisoned at Ravensbrück. Estimates say at least 50,000 0 died. The audience that night didn't need numbers. The images were enough. One POW tried to stand, mumbling, "That can't be true." A guard's voice, low and steady, answered, "It is." She sat down hard, trembling. Another woman covered her ears, whispering, "We didn't know, we didn't know." But the truth was there, undeniable, projected in light and shadow. The reel rolled on: medical experiments, gas chambers, children's shoes in piles. When it ended, the screen went blank. No one moved, no one clapped, no officer spoke. The generator sputtered to silence, leaving only the sound of rain tapping the canvas roof. For a full minute, the camp stayed frozen. Then a woman began to sob, quietly at first, then harder. Another joined, and then another. It spread like a wave, low and human. No guards stopped them, no one dared. Later, a British medic wrote in his report, "That night I saw them see." When dawn came, the prisoners lined up for breakfast as usual, same tin mugs, same bread. But everything had changed. They ate slowly, eyes distant, movements careful, as if each crumb carried the weight of what they had seen. The next act of the story wouldn't be about punishment, it would be about atonement. The morning after the film, the camp moved slower. The usual chatter was gone, replaced by a strange quiet that felt heavier than orders ever could. The women cleaned, worked, ate, but without speaking. Eyes stayed low, hands steady. Even the guards seemed to sense something had changed. No jokes, no shouting. Just silence and duty. In the infirmary tent, a British corporal cut his hand while unloading medical crates. It was nothing serious, a quick slice on a tin edge, but he swore under his breath, blood dripping on the floorboards. A German prisoner nearby, once a Luftwaffe clerk, instinctively stepped forward. "Let me," she said softly. The corporal froze. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Guard and prisoner, two enemies under one roof. But then he nodded. She tore a strip from a clean rag, wrapped his finger carefully, her hands trembling. When she tied the knot, she murmured, "You should wash it." He smiled faintly. "You sound like my mum." She almost laughed, almost. Then she stepped back, unsure if she'd broken some invisible rule. That was how it started, small gestures. A prisoner helping the medics wash instruments. Another volunteering to sort medical supplies. The guards didn't forbid it. They let it happen. Soon, the infirmary had more hands than it needed. Within weeks, female POW were assisting in over 200 British-run recovery hospitals across occupied Europe. Some by choice, some by order, but many because they needed to do something good again. One of the nurses later wrote, after the film, "No one told us to help. We just couldn't sit still." In the evenings, when the lamps glowed low and steam rose from soup pots, the same women who once believed they'd be shot now tended to Allied wounds, mended bandages, and learned words like "thank you" and "please" in English. The guards began to see them not as prisoners, but as people rebuilding themselves piece by piece. By May, whispers drifted through the camp like rumor smoke. Release orders might be coming. The women didn't celebrate. They didn't dare. Freedom, after everything, sounded like a word too large for them now. And when the trucks finally rolled in, they weren't painted grey like before. They were olive green, lined up in neat farewell formation. The sky that morning was a dull silver, neither storm nor sunshine, just quiet light. Trucks stood in perfect rows outside the wire, engines idling low. A few British soldiers straightened their caps, their faces unreadable. It wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't even a farewell. It was a release, quiet, procedural, almost holy in its restraint. The German women stood in lines, clutching small bundles of belongings. A comb, a notebook, a ration tin. The handkerchiefs they'd been given weeks earlier. The major read the list of names slowly, one at a time. Each woman stepped forward, saluted out of reflex, then stopped halfway, remembering there was no flag left to salute. For every prisoner, a British guard handed over a paper packet, brown, folded, tied with string. Inside, the items confiscated upon capture. Family photos, small crosses, wedding rings. Some cried, others just stared, faces hollow but grateful. One woman opened her packet and found her mother's locket still inside, polished clean. He even wiped the dirt off, she whispered. The statistics would later note that over 25,000 German women POW were released by August 1945, under British control, processed, documented, and sent east toward shattered cities. But in that moment the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the look in their eyes, a kind of exhaustion that no sleep could cure. Private Lewis stood among the guards, his rifle slung low. The same woman he'd comforted weeks ago approached him in line. She looked thinner, older somehow, but her gaze was steady. "Thank you," she said in halting English. He nodded once, trying not to smile. Regulations said no contact, no sentiment. But when she climbed into the truck, she looked back, and he raised 2 fingers in a silent salute. No cheers, no applause. Just engines starting, boots shifting, the heavy rhythm of tires rolling over gravel. The convoy moved out slowly, one truck after another disappearing into the grey morning. At the gate, the British major stood still until the last truck vanished. Then he turned to his men. "All right, lads," he said quietly. "Clean the yard." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. But before those women vanished beyond the trees, one final moment would bring tears to both sides, a parting gesture so small it would echo for decades. The trucks had already started rolling when the order came down the line, "Hold them a moment." Engines coughed to a stop, exhaust fading into the mist. Confused faces peered from the truck beds, German women gripping their satchels, half afraid something had changed. Then a British corporal walked forward, a crate in his arms, its sides marked with a red cross and faint stenciled letters, "Rations Personal Issue." One by one, the soldiers began handing out small tins, each neatly wrapped in brown paper. Inside were biscuits, a tea sachet, a bar of soap, and a folded note stamped with the camp seal. It wasn't standard procedure, it was something decided quietly by the guards themselves. The message was simple for the road. The women accepted them with trembling hands. No one spoke for a while. Some just stared at the tins like relics. For soldiers who'd once been ready to die for an empire that fed them lies, it was impossible to understand this mercy in a metal box. The tins weren't worth much, maybe 2 shillings each in military leftovers, a gesture at best. But in that moment they meant everything. One woman turned to her friend, whispering, "They send us home fed, not as enemies but as people." Another nodded, clutching her tin like a medal she hadn't earned. Private Lewis stood near the last truck watching the exchange. He'd scrawled a single word inside one of the lids before sealing it, "Peace." He'd never know who got it. Maybe the woman with the grey eyes, maybe someone else, but it didn't matter. The act was enough. Engines started again, gears grinding. The convoy lurched forward slowly, wheels splashing through puddles. A few of the women waved from the back, hesitant, unsure if it was allowed. The guards didn't wave back, but several removed their caps as the trucks passed. Respect, not ceremony. The road stretched east, toward ruins, ration cards, and the long rebuilding ahead. Behind them, the Union Jack fluttered weakly on the camp's pole, a symbol not of conquest, but of something quieter, restraint. As the last truck disappeared beyond the trees, the camp fell silent again. But one woman, her ration tin clutched to her chest, turned for a final look at the flag, the guards, the place where mercy had rewritten her understanding of war. And that memory would follow her home. Decades passed before anyone spoke of it. The war had ended, the world rebuilt, and those young women scattered, some to East Germany, some to the West, some across oceans. But the memory never faded, not the hunger, not the fear, not the rifles that didn't fire. It lived in their diaries, in yellowed notebooks, hidden behind family photos. In one such journal, found years later in Hamburg, a single line stood out in slanted script. "They disarmed us with decency." That sentence said what none of them could have back then, that kindness had done what bull, it's never could. Historians pieced together their stories slowly. Letters surfaced, cross-checked with British camp reports. Interviews revealed a quiet pattern. German female POW who described their captivity not as torture, but as transformation. According to post-war surveys, 72% of Axis prisoners held by the Western Allies later described their treatment as fair or good. Many credited that experience with reshaping how they saw the world and themselves. One of the former guards, long retired, was asked in a 1970 BBC interview why he'd shown compassion. He paused, lit a cigarette and said, because someone had to stop the hate somewhere. Simple words, but they carried the weight of an entire generation exhausted by vengeance. For the women, the hardest part was returning home. Germany in 1945 wasn't a nation, it was rubble. Some were met with suspicion, branded collaborators or traitors. Others never spoke of their captivity at all. Yet when asked years later what moment haunted them most, it wasn't the surrender or the film or even the hunger. It was the moment they realized they'd been treated better by their enemy than by their own commanders. One former Flakhoff typist wrote in 1959, "We were not shot, we were seen." Those few words became a quiet echo across archives and documentaries, proof that sometimes the most devastating truth isn't cruelty, but unexpected mercy. In every war, someone decides when violence ends. For those women, it wasn't on the battlefield or the day Germany surrendered. It ended when a British major lowered his rifle and said, "Feed them." And that single command, simple, human, unrecorded in any official order, became the kind of victory no statistic could ever measure.